Yes, we are recording.
Cool.
Yep.
Yay. All right.
All right, cool. So this is our very first mini episode for Nature Chat, as we are going to call it.
Yay.
So since this is the first mini episode, I guess we should probably just talk about what's going on. So this is a recap episode. We're going to talk about everything that happened in the first episode. We're going to talk about some of the things very briefly that we discussed, and then if we have a guest like we do today, one of our players, Nancy Miorelli, she's amazing. We are going to do a very short interview with them to figure out what they are all about, and then maybe end with talking about current events or something like that. Just something, maybe something cool in the news that you should read, or a scientific paper that you should check into. So yeah, let's begin. Cheryl, you want to do the recap?
Yeah, because it just happened and I did the thing. So this was our very first episode of Nature Check. So all of the individual party members, or the player characters, found themselves in a burgeoning port town of New Seychester on the newly accessible continent of Arda. So they all made their way through the town, and eventually, some of them taking maybe a longer route there than others, found themselves
the longest route.
They all found themselves in a tavern called the Marked Bird, in the market district of New Seychester. And just as Nancy's character Kay had entered the tavern on a delivery run, some hooligans in the bar, some ruffians, started a fight over some bad fish that they had been served in their meal. And they attacked the barkeeper, or the tavern owner, and combat ensued where the PCs did a great job defending and healing and protecting the bartenders.
Some of them. My character definitely did not.
That's okay. And also slicing and dicing up the bad guys.
My character was maybe a little bit too brutal.
Slicey dicey. And then a guard came and escorted the bad guys away. The player characters had a few moments to sort of get to know one another, and they also met the cartographer of the Royal Academy of Explorers from Tenebria, which is a human country on another continent. And this cartographer, Casper Reed, wants the player characters to, since it sounds like they might be going out to explore the continent of Arda anyway, he wants them to bring back information about the things they find while they're exploring, and he will pay them for it.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the episode,
we had stingy up front, though, to be honest.
I mean, he didn't have any money; he just had giant.
We didn't get a grant.
We didn't get a grant.
We're running on grant funding. We're writing some grants.
And then at the end of the very end of the episode, we had a nice, albeit heavy, a conversation about the idea of what Casper is asking the player characters to do, which is basically a colonizer sort of perspective on this quote unquote new and undiscovered world, which, yes, is exactly what I had intended by introducing this setting and that character. So it was a really good conversation for us to sort of begin tackling that question of.
And shout out to Rebecca, who started the conversation by not so subtly holding a piece of paper up that said colonization to the guy.
So it was definitely the beginning of a conversation that I'm hoping we will continue to have amongst ourselves and with you, the audience, as we continue this story, because it's a concept that is going to be rather central to how we interact with the world of Arda that I'm creating. Yeah.
So what's going to be happening kind of the first time next week? It sounds like we're going to rescue someone.
So the I guess we can call them the plot hooks that are dangling in front of you right now. Cedric seems real bent on helping the girl that he saw in the doorway of a brothel. There's also
which started his epically long journey to get to
it was like the family circus. The little boy takes the dotted line route. Have you guys seen that comic?
Yeah.
He literally walked past the meeting point and it was like, oh no!
Yeah,
And
I
he
just kept going. And I was like,
Yeah.
you saw the thing. Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like Cedric wants to help out the girl he saw in the doorway of the brothel. You also have this weird thing where like the fish was so bad that these ruffians decided to attack poor Leon Feist, the owner of the Marked Bird Tavern, over it. So that might be worth asking a few more questions about. And then of course you've got this thing where a few members of your group were already planning on going out and exploring Arda, and Casper Reed has asked you that you just bring back information. So you could just start exploring.
Yeah, well, and
Sounds like you've got a few different avenues to get going on next time.
yeah, and my character is one of those.
Yeah.
One of those people. So looking for colleagues. So yeah, I guess so the first question that we should really address on this minisode, and it's actually gonna lead really nicely into what we were talking about with the colonization stuff. But why are we choosing D&D to talk about science?
I'm a huge nerd, and I've been intrigued by the idea of D&D for a while. And I'd also, as part of my own science communication efforts, started thinking about how we could use video games and tabletop role-playing games to teach biology and ecology principles. And because ecology is a huge part of D&D, even though that's not necessarily something people think about. There are many, many monster manuals. There are lots of creatures that we populate this world with, and there are many biomes and ecosystems where those creatures live. And
Fun fact, I actually, one of my dream jobs was actually being like an environment video game creator, because I was always so pissed off to find like there are too many apex predators here. Like there's no way this thing could be that big. There's no way this scorpion lives here,
Yeah.
So I had always been thinking about ecology in video games for a long time, and wanted to make them right and better.
Yeah, well, I had a conversation on Twitter with Derek Hennon, and I'm so sorry I'm forgetting the other person right now. But we were talking about how in Zelda Breath of the Wild, how you you shake. I don't remember. You shake like some kind of tree and like the wrong seed falls out of it or something like that. And so yeah, it was this idea that like no, like that feels simple, but like it's it's not. And so how can we use these games and the fact that player characters in a D&D story would venture everywhere from a swamp to the frozen peak of a mountain to subterranean lairs, and there are all these different creatures that live there, and like of course you wouldn't put a violet fungus at the top of a frozen mountain because of course it doesn't go there, right? So like they have biome notes and environment notes in the monster manuals, and those are my favorite books because I love thinking about how to populate this world with all these monsters. So yeah, that's something I've been intrigued by for a while, and I was so excited that Joe had not only the good idea but also the gumption to tweet about it so that we could start finding one another.
Yeah. Well, how this whole thing started was and I can't remember the person's name right now, but they were like, yeah, it would be really fun to start a D&D game because apparently every D&D game that is ongoing is so far along that it's really difficult to get other people to join. So I sort of took that to heart, and I was like, well, what if we could, just sort of play a D&D game amongst scientists? And the idea sort of died a little bit because I wasn't really quite sure what to do with it. And one of the things there's two things about D&D that I've always found really interesting. And one of them was how it can bring people together and show how people interact. And there's a really good episode of Community called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which I think does this really well. And my whole thing with all of my SciComm projects has always been humanizing scientists and showing how scientists interact and how we think and we solve problems, and getting us into a role-playing game like this and actually getting us to solve problems, I think, is a really good analog for how scientists do lab work, because we all have different skills, we all have different abilities, and we collaborate amongst each other to fully utilize those abilities. The other thing that I think is really interesting about D&D comes from the show Stranger Things, where the kids actually use the language of Dungeons and Dragons to be able to explain what's happening to them. And I think that there's some really good analogs in D&D, as you and Cheryl were talking about, Nancy. There's some really good analogs in D&D for the natural world, especially with the cultures that you encounter, the ways in which you have to interact with people, and the ways in which people sort of have to interact. So I felt that there was a lot of really interesting stuff that we could do, but I wasn't really sure how to sort of mold it all together. And then, Cheryl came along and really sort of push this idea to completion, and she's the one who had all of the good ideas.
Well, I mean, like I said, you were the one who was brave enough to tweet about it in the first place, and I didn't want to step on your idea, but when you said, "Oh, I'll DM, but I've never played before," and I was like, "Oh, I think this is a good idea, and I don't want it to fall apart because you don't know,"
Yeah.
it was definitely from a place of like, I want this to succeed, and it is so hard. It is so hard to play this game if you've never played before, let alone try to like run it. And so I saw how much positive response it got from your tweet, and I was like, this is a thing that should happen because people are enthusiastic about it. So I'm so excited that we've managed to work together.
Well, and it took like 6 months of development, something like that. This has been in the works for a while. So
in amongst me trying to finish my master's thesis and you starting a PhD program and all of the other things about life that happens.
Yeah. Oh God. So so moving on to the sort of theme of the episode, which I think was colonization. Definitely.
Yeah, this idea of you guys coming to a new unexplored place, and I mean, it's new to all of you, which is fine, and even it's the town itself is new to everyone except Nancy's character. So like, you are exploring it in terms of like learning it yourselves. But yeah, this idea that, some of us are here to explore and to find things out, and we, want things and need things from this place. And so it's some of the player characters and many of the NPCs or the non-player characters are all viewing this continent as in a very utilitarian way, right? There are things here that we can take, things here that we can get. Whether that's something physical like resources or something non-tangible like the information Fletcher and Lucanus are looking for, right? Those are there are things to be gotten here. And so this is colonization in a very literal sense, and also in the sort of like intellectual colonization.
And
I think my character is interesting because she's like lived in this town her whole life, and she hasn't really thought about the outside world. So she has like nothing personal to gain from it. I think she is coming from, and she's young too. She's like about 18ish. She doesn't actually know how old she is, and she grew up on the streets. So I think it'll be really interesting from her perspective because she's a little bit naive. Like she is really just going out because she's curious about the world around her and is not necessarily looking to get anything from it.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be interesting because she won't really have any preconceived notions other than the townspeople are like, well, it's wild and crazy out there. But she's like, it's not a city. Of course, it's wild and crazy out there.
Yeah. Well, I can't really talk about too much about my character's motivations without giving a whole lot away. But I think there was a line in the episode, something to the effect of, I'm trying to figure out what happened in my land, and that journey's brought me here. And I can't really say much more than that, but from that, it's pretty obvious that my character doesn't want anything material from this, but some of those spiritual things can still be incredibly damaging. So I went to an anthropology talk like last fall here at the University of Wyoming, which it's kind of a long story about why I went, but one of the things about this talk was a lot of the reasons why we know a lot about indigenous people is because of missionaries, and that is, that's an incredibly exploitive relationship because they're coming into, like, they don't want anything material from the people, but they are coming from the outside to the inside with the intent to change their beliefs to something that originated outside that culture. And even non-material things, non-material desires can be just as damaging, if not more damaging, to people than the material exploitation.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, and you brought up missionaries, and Cedric, I think, flat out said it. So yeah, Cedric is a missionary. Fletcher is here for information. Lucanus is here for information. Kay lives here, and Artemis is, well, she's here. But yeah, at this point,
Present.
yeah. Well, her motivations are perhaps a little less clear than some other people's, but yeah. So at least at this point, it doesn't seem like anyone in the party does want any material goods, as it were, from Arda, right? You're most of you who do have a reason for being here specifically want some sort of intellectual or spiritual or maybe some combination of both gain from this. And so that's really interesting to think about that, like, how do we use places and cultures, because it's not just about taking things away.
So that's for the people at home, that's something definitely to watch. Just sort of pay attention to how we go into these areas, how we interact with people, and most importantly, how people interact or how people react to the way that we interact with them. Because and I don't want to rehash everything on the minisode, but I think that a really good example of this really is how doctors have to fight Ebola in Africa, because there's been so much exploitation, and people have treated a lot of people in African countries very, like, so poorly that people come in, and we don't start from the place like, this disease is what's happening to you, and we'd like to help. That's sort of where people assume that we start. No, because of the exploitation in that country, and a whole bunch of other things. I'm vastly oversimplifying the problem, but because of all the problems with the way the outsiders have treated a lot of people in these countries, we literally have to start from a place where this disease exists, and that's a huge public health problem, just because of distrust, and in many cases that distrust is logical and rational.
I think that this colonizer conversation, and what we did in the main episode was definitely a lot more than this. But I think it's also important to think about this, like we said, like, yes, we are right now 6 white people, but we're doing our best to sort of like work through and learn this empathy in the real time of the game. But that's also this idea of like, we are playing characters. And so, like, even though we as people know that this idea of a colonizer mindset or colonizer behaviors, that's wrong, and that, we do our best, coming from where we are coming from with the knowledge we have, we do our best to avoid those things in our real lives. The characters might not. And so it's this idea that, like, we're playing characters and we're not metagaming, because what we're going to be doing is sort of like relearning those lessons, right? We're going to go through the process of exploring those moral and ethical dilemmas and sort of, in real time, rather than in, decades or hundreds of years, do it in a few months of playing this game, perhaps, relearn the lesson of why those things don't work and why they're bad. And so that'll be really interesting to watch too, this idea that, like, well, we know what the endpoint is supposed to be, but like, how do our characters
actually get there?
To watch the process will be really interesting.
Sorry.
One thing I kind of, so there's a lot of kind of parallels that I have found so far in our game and even in our practice sessions that have like mirrored a lot of things that I see in Ecuador, which is really crazy. I kind of joke that Ecuador is stuck like throughout the ages, everywhere from the 1500s all the way up to 2019 in different aspects. But one of the things is like, in the episode I talked about this church of gold that had like 5 tons of gold in it, but it was actually run by the Jesuits, who are really interested in learning and science. So a lot of like some of the original texts and a lot of some of the like original discoveries, however you want to say it, like them being written down and put down into a way that we can actually research and know about it, you know, was done by basically these missionaries as well. Like they were interested in not just the like converting the locals with all of the bad things that went along with that. But, you know, they did take really good notes, and they did actually have some really kind of like advanced at the time science. Like they even brought telescopes out here, which was, I mean, I think it's pretty amazing for like the 1500s, you know?
Yeah. So how do we get from it seems like the relationship with the Jesuits was a pretty beneficial thing to people down there. I mean, at least for the most part.
I mean, not really. I mean, they came in and they like wrote down all this stuff, which is useful because we can look back and like, you know, have species and drawings and all that stuff. But they also kind of like murdered and enslaved the locals and stole the gold to paint their church.
So it was the Jesuits that did that. Okay, I thought that
and there's like lots of religious iconography as well. So like the white saint is like there's like the devil like demon person, which looks very indigenous in the painting, or is an indigenous person with like the white saint like healing them and like whatever. So like it wasn't good for the people.
It was kind of the opposite because smallpox doesn't heal. Yeah, it's sort of like a reverse cleric situation there, as far as I know. So, I had actually not known that it was the Jesuits that did all that stuff, because I previously lived in St. Louis, actually, across from a Jesuit university, so I had the opportunity to meet a couple of the professors while playing Pokemon Go. And great Pokestops at the Jesuit school in Florissant, Missouri. Got a bunch of really great EVs, which were totally useful. But that is not the purpose of this conversation. They always told me that they always came off to me as or presented themselves, I should say, as a sort of more tame and
well, no one sells bad apples.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. They always tried to come off to me as more tame and intellectual, and I just had always thought it was, other. I don't want to implicate any other, sort of sects, but I thought it was other groups of Christianity that were responsible for that. So,
I mean, I think they all took their toll.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
If you like, you can say like some were worse than others, but at the end of the day, like,
I mean, I don't remember I don't remember who exactly told me this, but when we were in Ecuador, somebody quipped that, the entire history of South America is everybody was doing just fine, lots of great flourishing civilizations, and then the Spaniards came and killed everyone.
Well, like, that's the thing. I like what the Spanish did was like terrible, and I'm not going to say that it wasn't. But there were like, at least in Ecuador, I can really only speak from Ecuador's history, but there were lots of indigenous cultures all throughout. And then it was like the Incans that came up and murdered and took their cultures. So we kind of, for me, it seems like we tend to really be like, oh, the poor Incans, like we're like, killed and destroyed by the Spanish. But really, they did that first. There's this really interesting site in the south of Ecuador called Inga Pirca, which just literally means like the Incan wall. It doesn't have like a real name to it. But there is the people called the Cañaris. And the Cañaris like build in very like circular, where the Incans like built like big square blocks and made big square temples. And normally when the Incans came, they would just like wipe out everything, wipe out the culture, wipe out the structure, and then build their own stuff on top of it. But this was a really interesting mix where the Incans still kind of did that, but they kept some of the original architecture and kind of built more on a circular. So they still built like temples with square blocks, but the temple was circular, and some of the other living areas. And only part of it remains because after the Incans came in, we're like, all right, we're going to stomp out your culture and like kind of half rebuild you. The Spanish came in and were like, you know what's convenient for building churches? Square blocks. Look at this temple made of square blocks.
Yeah.
So it seems really interesting that we teamed to like demonize the Spanish, but it was like that was happening here in our history, as if it belongs to me. It doesn't. Ecuador's history as well, like, you know, with the Incans coming up through Peru. So I think that's like a really, that to me was like kind of one of the more interesting points. Like the more I learned about the Incans, I was like, wow, and so one of the things I really try and do on my tours is bring people to archaeological sites that were even before the Incans got there. When like some of the evidence of these early people, and there's not a lot of money to research them. And there's like some areas like on the coast, for example, where like, oh yeah, you can just find like bits of pottery from some of these ancient civilizations that wash up on the beach, or just like show up in the rivers. Like I've picked one up, like you just like pick up a piece of a pot that's like a couple thousand years old, because no one's out there studying it, you know?
Yeah. And in South America, I want to say this paper came out last year, but what they found was that fruit trees in the South American rainforest do not grow in completely random patterns. They tend to grow around areas where we know that ancient groups of humans lived, and you know, the agriculture. I'm not exactly sure when the South America, you know, when their agricultural system started, but it was obviously very, very complex, far more complex than we realize. And you know, when I made the statement in the nature check discussion about having a long way to go, you know, I know that indigenous people fought wars, but I mean, I didn't exactly grow up in an environment where this sort of stuff was taught. You know, I grew up in the Midwest, and we'll just say there's some social issues with this sort of thing in the Midwest. And, you know, I was sort of taught the names of indigenous people, and, you know, I can name certain tribes: Sioux, Cherokee, Iroquois, and I have a rough idea of, you know, what lands that they sort of occupied before the settlers came in, but I know almost nothing of history because I wasn't taught it. And you know, we arrived in, you know, European people arrived in America, you know, 400 years ago, but there's 9,400 or 9,600 years of history left where important things happened, including a giant friggin' plague, you know, right around the time the Europeans arrived. So one that was analogous to the Black Plague in Europe, but most people don't even know about that. So yeah, I'd like to be educated more on that. And
I joke all the time that I know more about Ecuador's species, ecology, and history than I ever did from the United States.
Yeah, no. So yeah, and it's great that you incorporate that into your tours.
That feels like a great segue for us to do our first scientist spotlight as well.
Yeah.
That's why Nancy is here with us right now, right? So we want to know a little bit more about the person behind the character Kay and what you do and who you are. We've already heard a bit about your Ecuador experience, which always makes me so jealous because it sounds like an awesome place.
Yeah.
Come visit me. Mentioning in like nature check, like I love it. I obviously chose it, but it's not without its problems. I'm not going to say it's perfect. And especially as we're talking about some of these social issues, like I feel like I can talk a lot about like this is my experience from the United States and this is my experience from Ecuador, and they're just very different. Anyway, so my name is Nancy Miorelli. I am an entomologist, which means that I study bugs. Although technically now, I guess I'm not even a scientist. I am a tour guide. So here in Ecuador, one of the things I noticed is that if you want a bird guide, there are tons of people ready to line up and tell you all about Ecuador's amazing birds. We have amazing biodiversity here. In one area of the cloud forest, there are 600 bird species out of the 1,500 that are in Ecuador out of the 10,000 worldwide. So like just to give you an idea of like the biodiversity. And when I started asking people about insects, there's a couple of professors here who are really amazing and do really amazing work, but no one who really does them in a science communication tourism aspect. In fact, insect tours worldwide are not super a thing. So I decided to start my own tourism business, really focus on a lot of these issues that we're talking about, actually. Like my whole jam is the interconnectedness of how ecology, like geology shapes the landscape. So then that shapes the ecology, which shapes the biology that you find on it. And then how do people interact with this biology and how do people interact with conservation? And so in some areas like the coast, which is 95% deforested, I really feel like you're on the forefront. It feels very much like the Wild West. I'm not the only person who has made that statement. It's like, oh, it's like the Wild West. But you really see like, I don't want like battle's like a strong word, but like
conflict.
Conflict, yeah, between the importance of conservation, but also like people need this land to give you things that you like bananas and coffee and chocolate and, palm oils and Nutella, like for example. So one of the things that I personally really like and is an important part of the tours that I provide is that you don't see just like, I don't really super like going to the Amazon because I feel like it's kind of like Disneyland. You just show up and you're like, look at the monkeys. And then you like go and you sail and you go across the boat and you visit like a community. And then you go back and you look at the monkeys again. So that to me, that feels very much like Disneyland. So I really like the coast because you're staying with local people. I come in, I'm like, this is my friend Boris. He owns this land. He's protecting it from illegal hunters. Let him tell you his story. Watch how he does like traditional methods of grabbing like crabs out of the mangroves and like let him share his home with you for today. And to me, I think that's a much more valuable experience having done a bunch of different types of tourism in Ecuador. So that's specifically what I focus on. And so it's interesting because like a lot of things we've come up in our first play session and some of our practice sessions, I'm like, oh my God, I've like literally lived this already.
Yeah. And do you feel like Kay is going to bring any of those experiences from like the opposite side, or at least your interpretation of the opposite side?
Kay, I think it's very much like a blank slate. So I think she's going to be very impressionable by what's around her. But I also feel like the town, from what I can tell, is mainly humans. And she isn't quite human. Like she definitely has some features to her that are definitely not from this world. Hint, hint.
Yeah. Don't give anything away.
And one of her best friends also is kind of like the demon people, and so she very much sees how he's treated. She's lived on the streets for a while, so she definitely sees like the differences between how different classes are treated. Like socioeconomic classes, like rogue versus, and like how race and is played. So she definitely has her own set of morals. But I think beyond that, like this whole idea of like colonization or whatever, I think she's going to be very like a blank slate to it.
Yeah.
So we'll see how she is shaped.
Okay. All right.
And maybe her friends will have an interesting influence on her, or maybe she'll decide that she wants to sort of go counter to them in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out. At least in our practice sessions, she and Cedric did not get along. So,
yeah.
But he also, and we aren't supposed to remember that. So, but and Cedric did just like save one of her good friend's life because she is like very close to the townsperson. So like she might be swayed initially by that, so we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see how it goes. Again, like Cedric's a missionary. Kay is very solidly skeptical about the gods and religion, especially because she's seen how like different people and different races are treated out on the streets. So,
yeah. And
but she has like no biological knowledge. She has no entomological knowledge. She has no ecological knowledge. Like,
Well,
she's like.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think you said you don't think you're a scientist anymore, but I don't know. I think that anyone who is like actively and intentionally engaging with the science in any way is a scientist. So I include our audience and the audience of my science communication as scientists as well, because you're actively curious and engaging with the world around you.
Yeah, I think I had said that I'm like not a scientist, but I am an entomologist, which was a little bit backwards.
Yeah,
but I'm like, I definitely am not like a researcher aspect of a scientist, but I very, very much am interested in science and like reading research papers and then translating that into something that most people can understand.
Well, and also look at the value that you're providing to the scientific community. Whether or not you're a scientist, you are, showing scientists these issues that they never would have thought about. And hopefully, at least, they'll go back into their labs and think maybe a little bit harder about some of these problems and come up with new questions, because...
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope that people really, my big focus is conservation. I never formally studied like conservation biology, but I do consider myself like a conservationalist. And my big thing is like you don't get a plot of land and just say like, peasants over there, don't touch it. We have built a fence around it, which I think is like in the States, we're like, oh, we have this national park and we have this and we have that. And then like, that's farmland over there. And this is this national park. But when you get down to countries like this, where that just doesn't work. It just doesn't. Like, people live in those areas. So even like in the Amazon, where it's a national park and it is protected, indigenous Amazonian tribes are still allowed to do their traditional hunting. So they will shoot monkeys. And so, like, that's an interesting thing. Like, how do you, like, monkeys are endangered species. Mm-hmm. They are like traditional people living their traditional ways. Like, how can you tell them no? So like, that's where these hard questions come up. And that's what I really want people to think about. I don't care if you don't really have an answer to it. I just want you to have at least like think about how messy conservation really is.
Yeah, no, because there's like any conversation about trophy hunting, for example, there are legitimate uses for trophy hunting. As unpopular as it is to say, there are ways that trophy hunting can be done so that it's so that if you say remove older male animals from the population so that there's less infanticide for some species, that's a good thing. And sometimes it takes on the form of pest control. People don't like to hear about lions being killed, but if you're a cattle farmer in Africa, that's how you make your living. If you have lions killing your cattle, they are pests, and they live around these things, and a lot of the people who complain about trophy hunting just don't. So,
one of the things I thought was really interesting, and so before I was doing my own tourism business, I was in an eco lodge for 2 years. And one of the best things about being that is I got to talk to so many people from so many different backgrounds, from so many different countries. And especially the Cloud Forest, high Andean region, we have spectacled bears, and one of their favorite foods are sugarcane and corn.
Oh, shit.
Which you can imagine is not great for the local farmers.
They are not popular.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of farmers will shoot the bears. And there's like this big kind of like, there's obviously a big disconnect here. Mm-hmm. And I met this one tourist from England. He's like, yeah, farmers in England have badger insurance. So they aren't supposed to shoot the badgers, but if the badger does damage to their crop, they're like subsidized by the government for it.
Badger
and he's
insurance.
Like, yeah, exactly. This is why I was like, wow, this is like, So if
I
anyone's
love
watching
badgers,
from like Europe or England, like let me know about that badger insurance. And he was like, maybe a good option would be bear insurance. You don't shoot the bear destroys your crop, and then it is like subsidized. Then the next question is like Ecuador is like a relatively poor country. We're definitely not third world. So a lot of people are like, oh my God, you're third world.
No,
We're definitely developing. Quito is just as like first world. I'm running like high speed internet, et cetera, et cetera. I think just for Ecuador, there's a divide between like the rich people and the rural people who are typically poor.
And
like
we see that in America too, although.
And exactly, it's my point. It's like like compare New York to the middle of Louisiana, like completely different.
I also can't. Oh, go for it.
So we have the same thing in Ecuador. So then the next question is like, if you had bear insurance, like how would the government subsidize that?
I would the people, like would these farmers out in rural Ecuador, would they even understand the concept of insurance?
I mean, sure.
Yeah, like insurance is required. Like we have health insurance and there's car insurance.
Yeah.
Like
okay.
I wasn't. Yeah. What I was going to say is I feel like that sort of pest animal insurance works better when you have systematically eradicated all of the other animals in your wild areas, Europe. So like, all we've got left to worry about is badgers.
Badgers, yeah.
They don't have wolves and coyotes and raccoons and all of these other things that we have in North America, or like it's more than just bears in Ecuador too. I must
say. Fortunately, like bears are kind of like the only thing that really go after those crops. Birds are actually like all the pretty tropical birds are actually big pests. Not big pests, but can be pests of like fruit. So my boyfriend and I, we always have a joke like we have to get to the papayas before the tanagers do, like and the toucans.
Yeah.
So it's like, is the papaya ready? Like, so, I mean, it's really interesting to think about like what pest species are in different places. Like, again, I would have never considered a badger a pest, but that person from England did. And like a spectacled bear, which is an endangered animal. It's endangered in Ecuador. It's doing pretty well in other countries, but in Ecuador, there's a lot of pride around it. So, and it's very threatened, mainly because of habitat loss and fragmentation. But to have like such a big, like, I don't know, charismatic megafauna, be like, oh, that pest, you know?
Well, and I mean, even those blue morphos that everybody loves, they're pests in bananas, right?
Yeah, they eat something in the banana family. I'm not sure if it's exactly bananas.
Okay, I thought they were pests of bananas.
I mean, there may be. I know they eat stuff in the banana family, so I'm sure if there's like a banana there, they will not hesitate to partake.
Yeah, and I'm kind of the same way. So actually, can I ask you kind of a dumb question?
There are no dumb questions.
Are lawns a thing in Ecuador?
No, and actually that's the coolest thing. That's one of the things I talk about all the time. Out kind of in the more rural areas, like, you'll have like a clearing where there aren't really any trees, and the weeds that spot up, like people will cut it down mainly with machetes, because like that is prime snake habitat, and we do have various dangerous snakes here. So they try and keep it like kempt in the fact that you cut it with a machete when it gets like ankle high, but it's not grass. On the coast, so where my boyfriend is, it's like grass and wildflowers and like weeds and whatever else happens to be around. Like more in the cloud forest, it's like cloud forest, like low, like first succession plants, which I have no idea what they are because I don't study plants. But no, lawns, as like we think about the manicured lawn, is not a thing. And funnily enough, my friends here in the States live in a suburb with like the very typical manicured lawns. And I sent a picture and sent it to my boyfriend. He's like, wow, it looks just like the movies.
Yeah.
I was like, well, yeah, where do you think the movies were filmed? Yeah. So like the whole concept of a lawn is just not really a thing.
Why do you think that is?
Like in the city, like there's not space for it. Out kind of more in the like richer suburbs, I'd say like Kumbaya would definitely have lawns behind them. Like that's pretty common. But it's just like, again, in this city. So it's like not like you've really gone out.
Yeah. Like
the habitat is already destroyed because you're in a city. Like, but a lot of people are really into gardening. And so they'll have like gardens around the area. And then in the cloud forest, like, why would you plant grass? I don't know. Like, why do we even plant grass? Like, who told us it was a good idea? I don't know. I just never.
There's actually like I actually sort of had to learn about the history of lawns for the project that I'm working on, which is really weird because but no. So the reason why lawns were a thing is they originally started as grazing pastures for rich people in Europe, and then they became a sort of defensive mechanism because just nothing was growing there, and people didn't have to, walk up, and they had to be able to see people walking up, and then it became a status symbol, essentially saying, hey, look at all this land that I'm not using for food production, peasants. So I was kind of wondering if in an area with less European influence, if lawns would be a thing.
Yeah, we definitely have like pasture grass, but it's definitely, at least from what I understand, not the pasture grass that we have in the States. Yeah. I'm not well versed in pasture grass. The only reason I think it's different is because people are like, what is this plant? I'm like, oh, it's the grass that they feed the cows. And they're like, really? That? And I'm like, yeah. That's what I've been told by literally everybody. So that. And then, so when you start getting like reforestation attempts, or even if it's just natural reforestation, you'll often see that grass as like your early successor. I don't know if it's a native grass. I don't know. It's just some grass that the cows eat. So, and then that grass seems to be just like left for pastures. And then again, people's houses. The most thing with like a lawn would be all the soccer fields. Every little town has a soccer field, but that is definitely grass.
yeah. Soccer fields are no. I would imagine that grass is something like either indigenous or something different than we used. Because
it's tall. It's like when it grows, it's like almost hip height, and the blades of grass are like that thick, and they're like kind of sharp on the side. That's the extent that I know about it.
I would imagine that it's different just because the different environment and geography and all that. So I know nothing about pasture grass, but I'm probably going to be learning that in the next year or so. Because hooray, PhD, plant biologist. It's an exciting new field of study, and that lawn thing was kind of mind blowing to me. And as I said, I've always wondered if it was in that area of the world.
So it's really interesting also in Ecuador, like different ecosystems. I know we're like super in the States, like, oh, wildflowers. But in like cloud forest ecosystems, like wildflowers aren't really a thing. You don't have, unless it's like there's a tree fall gap or disturbed areas, you really don't get like flowers, like short little weedy flowers like you think about. So even if you like let your lawn go natural, it still wouldn't look like a natural lawn in the States filled with wildflowers and like daisies and whatever. It's just like green leafy things that grow.
I've been loving hearing about your experience in Ecuador, Nancy, but how did you get there? And I know that question sort of ties into the last thing that we wanted to talk about in this little mini episode. So tell us more about how you wound up in Ecuador.
Yeah, so So I talked a little bit about this in the first episode. I talked about my advisor, but that was my previous advisor, and I quit his lab. And who took me in was this amazing professor, Marianne Shockley, who met an untimely fate, unfortunately, earlier this month. So anyway, she's the one who got me to Ecuador. It was my first year of grad school. We all have teaching duties. One of my students actually recommended me to her for her Ecuador Term Abroad program. I was like, Nancy's a great teacher, so like forever indebted to that student. Thanks, Becca. And I was at I think it was the Christmas party my first year, and Marianne was like, she came up to me. She's like, hi, my name is Marianne. I heard a lot about you from Becca, and I think you would be really amazing as a TA for this trip to Ecuador. How would you like to get paid to teach students about bugs? And I was in the jungle, and I was like, yes, the paperwork. Let me sign right now. I don't care. Yes. And then so she took me that first year, and she also took Joe. That's where Joe and I actually became friends.
Yep.
And then after that first year, I redesigned the curriculum because I thought it could be a little bit more rigorous, and I thought we could ask some more of these kind of like interesting questions. And then that created job security. So she took me back the next 2 years in a row. And then my master's was hard for me. I think I definitely like to do things in an unconventional way, which is why I love this SciComm project, because I'm all about unconventional SciComm. So grad school did not treat me well. I thought I wanted to be a professor. I thought I was going to just do the academic PhD route. And then after my master's degree, I was like, clearly not for me. So I'm going to run away to the rainforest for 6 months to figure it out. So the Eco Lodge that we worked with for that term abroad, I was like, hey, do you want an entomologist for a while? And they were like, yes, please. So I showed up, and 6 months turned into 2 years. And then when my volunteer visa was up, I had to make a decision. Am I going to go back to the States, or am I going to figure something out here? And I was like, I'm not going back. Like, this is my home now. Like, I love it out here. It's so, like, in some ways it's really wild and kind of allows you to create weird things and do things in an unconventional way. So I really just fell in love with it. It was like, I'm going to make it work. And I really want to spread the, like, love of not just Ecuador, this country that I've fallen in love with, but also insects, get people to look at insects in a different way, like in a different situation, maybe a little bit more into it, and then also talk about all these issues about ecology and conservation as well. So that's how I got here.
Yeah, so the reason why I went to Ecuador with Nancy is literally the exact opposite. So Marianne, who was sort of a friend at the time, had known that I was having a little bit of trouble learning how to teach, because the way that they teach you how to teach in grad school is essentially like trial by fire. They throw you into a classroom.
They don't teach you.
Ready, fire, aim.
Yeah. They throw you into a classroom full of students, and they're like, yeah, you're going to do well. And I did not.
Or not, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So, Marianne saw that I was struggling and, invited me down and, did a lot of work with me, showing me how to work with students and properly teach and all that. And
I think the students help too with you, to be honest, because like one thing I love term abroad. That's one of the things that I really want to start working with, is because like it kind of breaks down a lot of those barriers. So I felt like the students would be a lot more candid with all of us, which I think was really good for all of us to grow.
Yeah. And, that was, I sort of told this story on Twitter, but, it really bears repeating. She had this huge impact on me because she, along with you, taught me a lot about teaching, and, I wouldn't essentially be the person that I am today without that experience. And, I'm going to be teaching again here in about a year. And I'm going to take a lot of the lessons that she taught me and a lot of her philosophies with me. And it's not, I'm not going to have the trouble that I had last time. So, and as I said, it's all because of, her reaching out and her wanting to work with somebody who is struggling so extensively. And God damn, that is more rare than it should be.
And Marianne, for me too, like really encouraged me to do things that were considered weird. Like for me, science communication was always really important. And she was like, I don't care what the rest of the department thinks. Like if it's important to you, like pursue it in any way that makes sense to you. If teaching is important to you, like pursue it. She let me redesign a lot of her courses. She even like invited me to co-teach a brand new class, forensic entomology, and kind of do things in my way. Like I made a role-playing like case study that people, like the students had to figure out and solve and do. And, it was such kind of like a non-traditional way. And she was like, oh, that sounds so cool. Just go for it. So when I sat down, like in that moment that my visa was up and I was like, do I stay or do I go? I was like, I'm thinking maybe about doing like these weird bug tours. And she was like, go for it. Oh, honey, like do it. You'd be like really good at it. So she was really influential in that way, just kind of like she was so brave. Like one of the things I always remember about her is like she did all the outreach, and I feel like she got some flack from our department for really focusing on that over over research, and for her to just be like, no, go for it, like do what you believe in, you're gonna like it's gonna be so much better for you. She really gave me, I'd say, like the bravery to stand up and be like, I'm gonna do this weird crazy thing that I think no one else has done, and I'm just gonna like figure it out, I guess. But it was really because she not only encouraged me, but gave me steps along the way, like designing that forensic entomology course that I had no idea how to do. She was like, you can figure it out. We'll do it together. Don't worry about it. Like she really encouraged me to take on challenges and like not be afraid of them. Yeah.
And she was very hands-on too, which again, you know, it's not a lot of, you know, I've been in academia a lot. I've seen a lot of crap, and you know, not a lot of. I think she's the only professor that I've ever seen that worked that hands-on with students. Not only her own students, but the students of others. You know, reaching out to me the way that she did. So.
She really taught like how to be kind as well. Yeah. Like if a student is struggling or if anyone is struggling like with their work, there's probably an underlying something. Yeah. Even if it's just as simple as like the student isn't interested or thinks it won't matter to them, or they're actually struggling with some kind of big life thing in the background. She was always like, you know, how can we meet these students halfway to get them on board?
Yeah, and that was a point that she stressed repeatedly to me, and because of my academic background at the time, I didn't believe that was important because that's kind of how I was taught. She sort of disabused me of those notions, and really.
She's supposed to be here right now, actually. I got the call, and she was supposed to be in Ecuador like 3 days later. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had so for ESA this year is going to be in St. Louis, which is an area that I know really well, and there's this. Yeah,
I remember I was supposed to stay at your house before you decided to go for a PhD program.
Yeah, sorry about that. So there's this restaurant in St. Louis called Mission Taco that's basically the Marianne Shockley of tacos. They try all sorts of weird things, and I had actually been putting off a call because of all this, because the move to the new program, about maybe having team up between David George Gordon and Mission Taco, which is something that if she had eaten there once, I know that she would have moved heaven, hell, and earth itself to make happen. With because for entomophagy stuff, and maybe I should have gotten the ball and rolling on that 6 months earlier, because I'm never going to have the chance to make that phone call now. So. So Marianne Shockley is, there's so many people who have stories just like ours. It's, we are not the only two stories out there by any means. Anybody from University of Georgia who was ever an undergrad or a grad student there likely has a similar story. And, a lot of people who met her at conferences, they certainly have.
Or like other random things that she did. Like Marianne even gave me the opportunity to bring bugs to Dragon Con and be invited as a professional at Dragon Con. Like, yeah, she was really all for this kind of like weird, like crazy, like any outreach that you possibly could do, anything that was creative, she was really for. So
she was very good at seeing opportunities to make connections that even a lot of people in the SciComm world miss. And yeah, so, but no, I just wanted to have a conversation with her, just because we lost somebody really important to both me and Nancy personally recently, but the scientific community is worse off as a whole because we lost this amazing teacher and mentor, and it's sort of a major event so.
Well, It very much sounds like her legacy for being brave and taking chances on things that are important lives on in people like you. So that's very comforting to know.
This project never would have happened without her. And Ask an Entomologist wouldn't have happened
As an
without her.
entomologist, I kind of think that anyone who like her influence has just rippled. So if I have someone on a tour who hated bugs before, and then I'm like, okay, maybe you should like not kill them, and they're like come around to that, and then
Yeah.
they go and they tell the next person like, hey, I had this amazing experience. Like I feel like she influenced like all 4 of us in that chain.
Yeah. Which we kind of didn't plug Ask an Entomologist in the first episode of Nature Check. I sort of feel bad about that.
You've got time.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ask an Entomologist is the other project that Nancy and I run. We answer questions about other people's questions about insects. Okay, so so we talked about Marianne and her influence from our grad school experience up to our current SciComm projects, including from Ask an Entomologist to this one, and including your tours. So yeah, is there anything that we should add on that? No?
I think we're good.
So, this is an episode, it's our first episode, and we are not going to end this episode on on these sorts of episodes on such a dour note. So is there anything that's been really good that's happened to you guys? Like any sort of like good distractions or nice things that you've found or enjoyed recently?
My tourism business is going like incredibly well, like better than I ever like imagined / to the point where it's almost overwhelming. So like that's exciting but terrifying all at the same time, but also exciting.
Yeah.
And we were talking about field work earlier and terrible weather, and I went out and checked my insect traps for the first time this season earlier this week, and they were not all flooded.
Yay!
So
that was actually I tried doing pitfall traps in the jungle, and they don't work.
Yeah.
Because they just flood.
Well, you have to do them differently, I guess. I've read many papers.
Well, I just want to like do some quick ones. But yeah, there's a lot of things that don't work in the jungle. Here's like a funny thing about the jungle. You know how like we have the ground beetles, like carabids?
Yeah.
Most of them actually aren't even on the ground in Ecuador. Most of them are on leaves.
Yeah. Oh, I believe that. Yeah.
Leaf litter.
It's like, who named these? Someone.
Yeah. Oh no, I think Nancy's cutting
Clearly
out.
not from.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Well, that must be the signal that we're done.
Yeah. Well, no. On my end, I'm actually really enjoying the project that I'm on. So I've it's a really kind of dumb question, but people don't really understand how weeds damage crops, and it's really fascinating to me that nobody's thought about asking that question for ever since agriculture started. So yeah, and then the other thing that I'm really excited and happy about is Good Omens dropped on Amazon Prime, and it is as close to the perfect TV series, at least for me, that I've found. So I've been really enjoying that.
Embrace your nerddom. Oh, I know what else I'm excited about. Today was the first day of June, and the restoration section of the other ESA that I'm a member of, so the Ecology Society of America. So I have both.
That's marketing.
The Ecology Society and ENTSOC. So, but the Ecology Society's restoration section, I've been working with one of the people who's sort of in charge of that, and June is hashtag #iRestore month on Twitter. So if you search hashtag #iRestore, you should find a whole bunch of tweets from restoration ecologists talking about who they are and what work they do where and why, and it's going to be one of those where every day has a theme, and we're going to talk about restoration ecology. So
that's awesome.
Awesome.
Very excited about
Very cool. Yeah. And by the way, we need to find a way to give a talk at the European Space Agency, one of their conferences, so we can just hit up all the ESAs.
Oh yeah.
So yeah. And I'm probably going to make that joke to my professor at some point, so I hope he's not watching this because it'll ruin the joke. So, anyways, yeah. So I think that those are all good things, and this is a good first mini episode. We had a fantastic conversation and a lot of fun playing the games. And in terms of like holidays or whatever, it's Pride Month. So happy Pride Month to everyone. Okay, so I think that's it. So yep, take care, viewers, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Oh, and hopefully we'll have a mailbag next week. So. All right. So I am going to stop recording.